year of its foundation, this facility assumed a more sinister purpose and became an extermination center after the Nazis declared their policy to destroy all the Jews living in German-occupied Poland. In October of 1942, 2, soon to be 3, gas chambers appeared at Majdanek concentration camp. And during the next 2 years, over 7,000 pounds of Zyklon B gas would be ordered for use there. During the same period, Majdanek's unfortunate inmates were subject to frequent mass shootings, as occurred on November 3rd, 1943, during the second liquidation of the Lublin ghetto. 18,000 Jews were ordered to dig mass pits and were executed. This stands as one of the largest single-day massacres in the history of the Holocaust, and the proximity of the killing site to the city of Lublin necessitated the use of loud music that was blared over loudspeakers in the camp to conceal the sounds of this terrible operation. At this time, Majdanek continued to serve its original role as a forced labor facility and a sorting point for the confiscated belongings of those consigned to death at Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and other death camps. Thousands were brutalized, starved, tortured, worked to death, gassed, or shot when they became incapable of further effort. During its 34 months of operation, an estimated 150,000 Poles were sent to Majdanek, including 90,000 Jews. One such inmate was the 14-year-old daughter of a Lublin brewer, Helen Levinson, our guest, who was arrested by the Gestapo one day in 1942 when she was walking to her violin lesson. Between 1942 and 1944, an estimated 78,000 Jews were murdered in Majdanek. The pre-war population of Lublin was 45,000, the Jewish population there. In 1945, it was 230. Those few survivors, like our speaker, witnessed their families torn apart and never again reunited. In fact, Helen lost her entire immediate family during the Holocaust. And these survivors had to experience years of unrelenting terror while in hiding, changing their identities, and employing other dangerous subterfuges to evade the vigilant Gestapo. Helen's story is a dreadful one, but it's also an inspiring one, a tale of hope, perseverance in the face of terrible odds and adversity, and it stands as an incredible example of the resilience and irrepressibility of the human spirit. In a moment, I'll let her recount her own story. But first, and as recently as 2 months ago, a timely reminder appeared in the New York Times of the importance of annual Holocaust remembrance events like this one, and the need to keep hearing stories like Helen's and other survivors who are associated with the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester, and thanks to them for helping to make this event possible today. In a February 2018 nationwide poll, the pervasive ignorance that exists today of what Winston Churchill called the 20th century's most horrible crime was clearly evident. 1,350 members of the public were surveyed and presented with some of the most basic facts about the Holocaust. Regrettably and tragically, it was found that 31% of the general public and 41% of the millennial generation knew little of the geographic and demographic extent of the Holocaust, and even less about the true mortality it exacted. 41% of the general public and 66% of millennials could not identify a single concentration camp by name, and that includes the infamous killing facility of Auschwitz. 52% of those surveyed did not know that the Nazis obtained power in Germany through the democratic electoral process. And 70% of American adults who were surveyed believed that fewer people care about the Holocaust today than have in previous decades. With this recent and sobering revelation in mind, Thank you very much, Helen, for coming to FLCC today to recount your experiences and help keep the memories of the Holocaust alive. Please join me in welcoming Helen Levinson.
Can you hear me? Unfortunately, I'm very short. Well, you know that my name is Helen Levinson, and Levinson was the name I got when I married Stanley here in the United States. When I first came to this country in 1947, I changed my name to Helen Weir, W-E-I-R. And this is the name my friends in high school knew me by. The principal, when I first came to school, asked me what my real name was. And my real name at that time was Prisuskier. That's P-R-Z-Y-S-U-S-K-I-E-R, Prisuskier, which is not very difficult for Polish people to pronounce. But he said, impossible. We cannot pronounce it, we cannot write it. You're going to have to find a different name. And we also had a little joke in our family. We said, you just cough once, sneeze once, and cough twice, and you got it. Weir was one of my great-grandmothers. I remembered that she had a name that was something like that, and I thought Weir was pretty short enough so people would be able to pronounce it, W-E-I-R. Of course, I also had another name, and that name was Kristina Helena Czerniakowska. Now, this is the name that I lived by and that got me through the Holocaust. I would like to begin during the time of the Allied Forces occupation of Vienna in 1946. A little girl, barely a teenager, all alone in a big city and a big hostile world. How does this young girl feel at this time, having left all that was near and dear to her behind in the greatest tragedy of all? I thought it would be best if I would read you a letter that I wrote from Vienna to my aunt in Rochester. How did I get to write this letter? After the Allied forces occupied Vienna, I wanted to get in touch with family that I knew I had in America and in that time Palestine. There was no Israel yet. I placed ads with the Red Cross and in different newspapers, one of which was the German paper Aufbau. Unfortunately, I did not know the names of my aunts and uncles. They had come here a long time ago, way before I was born, and they all changed their names. The only name that I knew was that of a dear friend of my family who had emigrated. All I knew was that he emigrated to America in 1938, into New York. And he would know the whereabouts of my family. His name was Saul Fromm, F-R-O-M-M. The ads ran for almost a year without any response. During this time, I was studying at the Vienna Conservatory, and I worked part-time in an office. Everyone in the office knew that I was expecting a letter, and the office jokesters would frequently kid me that a letter had arrived. On the 3rd of April, 1946, I was going home from my work in the office, waiting for a streetcar, when suddenly one of my co-workers breathlessly ran up to me, to tell me that someone had called from the apartment that I was living in, that 2 letters and a telegram had arrived for me. I jumped on the moving streetcar, which I normally did not do, and before it came to a stop at my street, I jumped off and ran all the way home to find that I really did have 2 letters and a telegram from my aunt and uncle in America. They explained in their letter how a friend of Mr. Salfrom in Rochester, New York, had seen the ad in the Aufbau and had contacted him. He lived within walking distance of my aunt and immediately notified her that I was alive. After a sleepless night in the wee early hours, I wrote this letter to my Aunt Louise Silverberg in Rochester, New York. The translation of this letter is as follows. Mein geliebtes, teures Tantchen, my beloved dearest aunt, yesterday evening I received 2 letters, one of which was from you and one from my dear Mr. Frum. Also a telegram from Uncle Julius. The feeling that I had at the receipt of these letters I can't, my dear aunt, express in words. I was afraid that from all the happiness I would lose my sanity. I have to excuse me. I have to admit that I cried like a wailing hound dog, and even now, with great efforts, I cannot keep my tears back. All night I have been holding these letters on my heart and read again and again the lines of your dear letter. Is it true, or is it but a beautiful dream from which one awakens? My dearest aunt, in the fall it's going to be 4 years since I am all alone, and since the Allied forces marched in, I have done everything in my power to find your addresses, but all was in vain. Mr. Salfrom is exactly just a rescuing angel, because I was beginning to despair. I really didn't know why I was saved and for whom I was still living. If not for the horrible unknown fate of my family, which will never give me any peace, I would now be the happiest human being on God's earth. My dearest aunt, I'm sure you would like all the details about all that has happened, but it is impossible to put in one letter all that my family and I have gone through. I feel the great miracle that I have been saved was not of my own doing, but God and my parents and grandparents must have been watching over me. If you want it, I will be more explicit in my next letter. In the meantime, I'm writing only about our last time together and the separation from my family. It was approximately the beginning of October 1942. Because my father was a first-class brewer, he was allowed till then to continue working in the only brewery in Lublin, Brauerei zum Hirsch, and with this saved also the lives of his entire family. What I have to explain to you is that brewers have to many times get up at night and check on the fermentation of the beer. That means in a big, huge hall where there was a lot of ice and the huge barrels, they were like a room, every barrel. My father had to climb on a stepladder and taste the beer. Well, the problem was that it was curfew time at night and you could not walk the streets because anybody see you on the street would shoot you. So they thought the best thing would be if my father would still remain living in the brewery. We had a special house where we could live, and part of a house, just apartment really. And with him, we could also stay there. This was part of my being saved too, because I did not have to be in the ghetto. Well, when the above-mentioned time came, all the rest of the Jews of Lublin were being liquidated. Also, my father received orders that my family must turn themselves in voluntarily to Majdanek concentration camp. And his boss, who was a German, they put a German immediately into the brewery to conduct everything. And he said, "You're just going to take your family to work." "Okay," said my father. I'll do that. Well, he promised to do so in order not to arouse any suspicion. He was inwardly convinced that neither he nor his family would go to that death out of their own free will. He said to us, if they want to shoot us, let them shoot us on the street if they want to kill us, with a bullet. For 2 weeks, we were able to hide out in the attic of the factory, in hunger and in cold and great anxiety, until a night watchman exposed us to the factory workers. I now have to explain the situation at that time. For every Jewish head, there was a reward paid of 100 zloty, and anyone who knew the whereabouts of a Jew and did not divulge this information was subject to the death penalty. The workers gave us the ultimatum that we leave the factory by morning or they will turn us over to the police. Now, the police was the Gestapo. We chose the first, so as not to arouse any suspicion, we were forced to separate. And so my mother and sister Fela, who was 14 years older than I, and we had been previously in East Prussia before we ran away when Hitler came along. My sister went to college, and of course was immediately forbidden to go to college. She wanted to continue with education. She was wonderful in Latin. She could almost speak Latin. It was like her own language. They went to an acquaintance who had the heart to keep them for 2 weeks. Now, the acquaintance was a librarian who was the library was kitty corner to the brewery. And since my sister could not get an education, she tried to educate herself, and she was always with the librarian getting books out of there. And the librarian became a very good friend of hers. And she said, look, fella, if you see that there's some problems and I can help you, please come to me. So that's why my sister and my mother went to that acquaintance, and she hid them for 2 weeks. Now remember, just 1 day not to be killed was like a whole lifetime. So 2 weeks was extremely long. The problem also was that the Germans knew exactly how to do all their dirty work, so to speak, because many of the Poles were very anti-Semitic. And like when we were laying on top in the brewery, on top of where the horses were fed out of straw and grass, that's where we were for 2 weeks. We could hear the people underneath us talking, and my father got a terrific shock because out of the Polish people, the workers who my father always helped, whenever a peasant came to deliver some, instead of money, some goods like lard or butter or some vegetables that we didn't have, he would divide it among the workers. And my mother would always say, well, you have just a little piece of butter. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to separate it and give a little piece to everyone. They're just as hungry as we are. And he heard one of the people, one of the workers underneath us, say something that really perturbed him. The one worker said, you know, they're paying zloty for every Jewish head that you give in. The other guy said, I don't have to have any zloty, any money. If I know of a Jew, I'll be only too happy to give him to the Nazis. This was a Polish man who my father liked very much and had helped all through the war with groceries and things. My father could not get over what this man had said. Now, my brother Alfred and cousin Eliezer, they went into the world in order to join the partisans. Well, my cousin was rescued by my father because they took the soldiers that they took prisoners and separated them. The Jewish soldiers were one side, The Christian soldiers were on the other side, and in front of the Jewish soldiers they put a machine gun, which would mean we probably were going to be machine gunned. Well, this young man, not only was he a good soldier, but he was also a very good furniture maker. So he sent word to my father that he's not going to live very long if he can possibly employ him at the brewery. And my father sent word that he requisitions him to come to the brewery to make barrels and fix barrels that were broken. And they let him out, and since that time he joined our family, was with us. My brother had been in the war, and he also did not become a prisoner because they buried their whatever they had in the woods, and then he was able to get home. I went to a person who had gotten many favors from my father, and to my surprise, my father was also there. We did not tell anybody where we were going, because if any one of us were caught by the Gestapo, they would be able to get out of us where the rest of my family is. Now this man informed us that he could not endanger his family by hiding two people. One he could possibly manage, and so I left. Of course, when I got up to leave, my father was very angry. He wanted to go. But I said to him, look, I am a little bit younger than you, and I thought maybe this way my father would be saved. I had with me a false birth certificate that my father gave me. He had a very good friend, a priest, and apparently the priest gave him a birth certificate of a Christian child who was not alive anymore, but was born the same date that I was. Even though it wasn't worth very much, because people had to have a Personalausweis. That means like a passport in which you had your picture stamped by the authorities that you're Christian, your parents also stamped by the authorities that you're Christian, and your grandparents. And they were all stamped by the authorities that they were all Christian. If any one of them was a Jew, you were considered a Jew. That's why I said it wasn't worth all that much. But I felt very happy with it. My dear father blessed me and begged me never to divulge to anyone that I was Jewish, to fight with all my strength and to survive despite Hitler. Hitler zum Trotz, he said, despite Hitler, you have to remain alive. Those were the last minute I spent with him. Before I left, he also gave me some zloty, 1,000 zloty. I never saw that much money in my life. But he said, if I need anything, if I have to buy something, at least I have some money with me. A compassionate friend of my father's had once promised that she would be able to get me false papers. She lived in another city, and somehow, without being observed, I was able to get there. She hid me in her attic and basement for 2 weeks, at the end of which I had to face up to the fact that I would have to help myself without papers. She hid me in the attic and in the basement, and it was a very tough time in Poland. In October, it is very, very cold. And of course, I must have caught a cold in the basement. And she said, I can go into her apartment as long as I keep very quiet. She gave me her key. During the day, they're both away working. But when it becomes evening, I should slip under her bed, because her husband didn't know about what she wanted to do. Well, it just so happened one night it was okay. The next night I sneezed, and her husband fished me out from underneath the bed and said to me, Helenka, that's what they call me in Polish, please, I am so sorry, but I am scared to death because around us are people, Polish people, who are not too happily minded about saving any Jews. And I'm afraid they're going to give us away. So I think I better take you back to Lublin. And I understood only too well. Everything was meant a death sentence, and they couldn't keep me. So I returned to Lublin. He had a little cart and a horse. And that's the way we returned to Lublin. I returned with the hope that I could find someone who could help me. I had to act with the greatest caution so not to be recognized by anyone. It was evening when I arrived in Lublin, and across the street from the brewery lived my very dear friend who I went to school with. In fact, we sat at the same desk. In Poland, a student doesn't have his own desk. We have a desk that two people sit at. And she sat with me, and her name was Krysia. Both of us, we had something in common. She was a fantastic painter. I always thought she's going to become something because she was very talented. And I was talented musically. I was studying the violin, and somehow my professor said that I did my work 3 times as fast as other people did. So I had great hopes that one day I'll be on the stage playing my violin. My friend and her mother had taught me many things about the Catholic religion. I did not want to impose on them because I knew what it would have meant to them to try to save me, but I had no other way out. I knocked on their window, and I could see by the mother's face that she was scared to death to see me. You know, she was in a basement apartment, so she came right down to the window, and I saw that she was pale as a ghost. She motioned for me to come into the side yard where no one could see us, and there she gave me some news of my family's whereabouts. My father was still hiding out in the brewery, so I knew that his friend did not keep his promise. And now I knew that my mother and sister were on the road to Warsaw. Now I knew they could never have gone through without papers because the Gestapo was everywhere. I wanted very badly to contact my father because she told me that my father was hiding in the brewery. And I knew approximately where he would be hiding. But this was an impossible chance to take, and I didn't want to jeopardize his hiding place. This woman saved me overnight, hiding me in a shed, and she recommended that I travel in the morning to Rozwadów, a nearby city, to enlist for work in Germany. She was afraid if I would enlist to work in Germany, in Lublin, I would be recognized. Right in the beginning of the war, she said to me, I was always in their house. Her daughter and I were very good friends. In fact, I even helped her decorate a Christmas tree. You know, for Christmas you could not buy any decorations. You had to make them yourself. And since I was very good with my hands, I was able to help her. And for me, it was great joy to decorate the Christmas tree that she wanted so very badly. She also said to me in the beginning of the war, she said, Helenka, I don't like what's going on. I would like you to tell your mother to pack a little suitcase for you and bring it here and leave it here, just in case. Oh, when I told my mother, she was just furious with me. She says, aren't you terribly silly? What do you think the Germans are, murderers? Do you know how intelligent they are? You know what poets and musicians came out of that nation? They're intelligent people. They're not going to murder us. You're ridiculous. But I must have bothered her enough to pack the suitcase that she finally did give in, and packed the little suitcase for me, and I gave it to Mrs. Bielachowska, was her name, to keep there. Now, in the morning, I was staying in a little shed from her friend. She didn't even want to take me right into the house that was so close to the brewery. So she took me down the street to a friend, and she pointed for me as she walked into the yard to get into a shed. I did. And she walked up the stairs to ask her friend whether I could stay overnight there. When I saw her coming down the steps with a big blanket and a bottle of something to drink, I knew that the friend said yes. And that gave me a little hope. Now, in the morning, she and her daughter came to get me, and she had the little suitcase in her hand. You know, you couldn't walk with a suitcase because that was very suspicious. Somebody would right away stop you and ask you where you're going, what's your name, and so forth. She walked in front of me, and I walked in back of her, whistling to myself. I always knew that once you whistle or sing something, you feel better. She walked in front of me, and she told me that if anyone would stop her, I don't know her, I should go right past her. If anyone should stop me, she's going to pretend that she doesn't know me. She took me to the railway station, and as we arrived there, she put my suitcase on the platform, and I put myself right next to her, the suitcase. I could not risk standing in line at the rail station, as the Gestapo was all over the rail station. And this brave woman bought the ticket, and passing me, she stuck the ticket into my hand without saying anything and left. I couldn't say goodbye to her. I couldn't even say thank you to her. And to this day, I feel terrible about it. Now, she kept on walking. I knew it would be dangerous to stand alone on the rail platform, so I joined some laughing young girls and joked with them, sometimes even about Jews. And so started the role of Kristina Helena Czerniakowska. When I finally arrived in Rozwadów, it was very difficult for me to locate the Polish Workers' Conscription Center. But after much maneuvering, I was able to find it. Now I have to tell you what was happening in those days, because you don't realize that many times the streets were surrounded. Even those who were not Jews, these were Polish people, young people. And they just took them, the soldiers took them, and they had to go to Germany. There was no questions asked. The parents couldn't say anything about it. They had to be slave workers in Germany. And my dear friend, thought the best way for me to survive was not in Poland, but to go to work to Germany. So I was happy to arrive in Rozwadów, but to find the place where I can put myself up for work was very difficult, because I was afraid to approach anyone and ask a question. Finally, I saw a man, who was an elderly man. To me, I mean, I was 14 years old. Even if you were 30, 40 years old, that was elderly to me. And I thought he was taking care of the suitcases. Maybe he'll be able to give me an answer. So I approached him and said, by any chance would you know what the street is, where the address is, where you can put yourself up for work to Germany? He says, to Germany? You want to go to Germany? A beautiful Polish girl like you? Don't be silly. My wife would be thrilled to have you in our house. Why don't you come with me to my home? I said to him, oh, that's very kind of you. But I'll just go and see what's going on there. And if I don't like it, I'll come back to you. Well, of course, he gave me the name of the street and the address. And I found it. No, for the usual way of Germans was just to round up people, and they stuck them in there into a special group. And then they would ship them out to either Germany or Austria. I was very much afraid that by offering to work, I would arouse suspicion. However, this was my only hope for survival. And I took it. I told the authorities a story about my parents being killed by partisans. Those were the people that were fighting, many of them soldiers, who didn't want Germany to succeed. And because I had nothing left, I wanted to see the world. I could just as well be useful in Germany, working in Germany. This is where my false birth certificate helped me greatly. They believed my story. I was accepted to go to work with a group of girls to Germany. At this time, I'd like to add a few incidents that were not in the letter, just to give you an idea of how important it was to keep one's emotions in control and to keep one's wits about himself at all times. A wrong word, a wrong move, or even the slightest sign of fright could mean a death sentence. When I was put into a large room with many other girls, I was to await further instructions. One of the girls kept eyeing me very suspiciously. I tried to ignore it and stayed as much as possible out of her way. All of us had to finally board the train in order to get to Krakow. There, workers from all over Poland were gathered in a classification center and then shipped out to locations in either Germany or Austria. I was just settling down in one of the compartments. Now, a train in Poland was different than our trains. As you walked onto the train, there was a long corridor with windows on the right-hand side, and to the left of you were compartments. And you opened up a door, there were like 2 big benches, and at least 6 people could sit on those benches. I was just settling down in one of the compartments in the train when the girl who had been watching me previously entered the compartment and started whispering to some of the girls, then motioned for me to come out into the hallway of the train. I knew something was wrong, and I braced myself. She angrily confronted me, saying, "What are you doing here? I know you are a Jew. I'm going to report you to my friends in the next compartment." Her friends were the police or the Gestapo. She was much older than I. I called her old because she must have been about 18 or 19. I then answered her as though I had been insulted, and I asked what gave her such a preposterous idea. To which she answered that she had seen me in Lublin with a Jewish armband carrying a violin. That was true in the beginning. We were first told to have a star, a brown star on the top of your chest, and it said Jude on it. Then they thought that was not visible enough from far, so they told us to get a white armband with a Star of David in blue on that armband and keep it on your left arm. Well, that's what she saw. She saw me going to my professor, and I made nothing of it. In the beginning, I thought, well, so I'm walking with a violin, so what? But I didn't realize anybody could have approached me and taken the violin away. That never entered my mind. I knew now that she recognized me. And without hesitating, I answered her, "Is my fault that my mother once was Jewish? I am christened Would you like to see my birth certificate and the signature of the priest that christened me? Oh, yes, she said, unbelieving. Show me. This was the second time my birth certificate helped me. My heart was in my mouth, as I knew if she would show my birth certificate to her Gestapo friends, it would just take a phone call to establish that the birth certificate was that of a dead child. I was in luck. Thinking that I was a Jew turned Christian, she seemed very embarrassed and became very friendly towards me during the rest of the trip to Krakow. I always wondered how one could change like that. One minute she was ready to kill me just because she thought that I was Jewish, and the next minute she loved me because she thought I was a Jew turned Christian. Another incident I would like to tell you about took place at the classification center in Krakow. We were all standing in lines. Women were standing in lines waiting to be checked by German doctors. You couldn't just go into Germany without an inspection. When my turn came, just a few minutes before my turn came, the girls in back of me were whispering something, and I turned around and I said, "What's going on?" Well, they told me that there was a Jewish girl in line and they just took her out to shoot her. You can imagine what happened to my stomach. I had butterflies in it. I already was suspicious that I may get to the same end. Now, just before the papers were in the hands of a German who was going to ask me my name, I heard one doctor right across from me talk to the other doctor in German, and I knew German just as well as they knew because my beginning years as a little child I was in Prussia, and my first language was German. He said to the other doctor, "Take a look at this girl." And he said, "Can you imagine? Was für ein semitischer Typus? What a Semitic type." My blood rushed to my head. I almost blurted out my real name. I forgot my alias. I pretended not to understand his question in the German language and smiled at him stupidly. He hollered impatiently for my name, and I regained my composure and was able to take a peek at the paper and saw the chip, and I gave him my name, Chernyakowska. If I had not done that, I would have been the next candidate to be shot. Fortunately, the doctors passed me through, and I was assigned to go to Vienna. And as fate would have it, the girl that I was afraid of was sent back to Poland because she had TB. She asked me when she said goodbye to write to her and let her know how I was getting along. Now you can imagine that I would have written to her. She guessed my background. After a difficult trip, we finally arrived in Vienna, where we had to go right through the mountains of Czechoslovakia. We were taken to the employment office. Well, that was not so easy because they were not giving us anything to drink, and the mountains were full of snow. So sometimes we had to risk when the train would stop, risk that it wouldn't start right again and get some snow in so we could have something in our mouth that was like water. Now we finally landed in fact, one time the train started to go and I was outside getting snow and somebody was kind enough to pull me in so I would not remain in the mountains all by myself. Now we were taken to the employment office, and because I was a little cleaner looking, I had the great privilege of being assigned to domestic work. I changed my employers twice. My first employer was a Nazi with 4 children. I was very much afraid that he would guess my background. Because I was underage, I had been told by the employment office that if the work would be too difficult for me, I could change my employer. my second employer, well, it just so happened, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that, because the lady of the house was very kind to me. I helped her all I could. I got up at 5 in the morning and I would light all the ovens. You know, they did not have central heating. So we had little ovens that would be warmed by lighting it and putting wood and cokes onto it. Because I had to carry the cokes from the basement up to the 3rd floor, which was really a little bit too difficult for a little girl like I was, very skinny. And since I had been told that I can change my employers, I banked on that. Besides that, the man of the house, the Nazi, told me that I had my own room to sleep in, but I have to keep my door open of the bedroom. Now, I was very much afraid. I could always control my speech and all that I said during the day while I was awake, but when I was sleeping, I was afraid that I may say something in my sleep that's going to tell him to wonder who I really was. Well, I told I could change my employer if I was not satisfied. That came to my mind. I went back to the employment office, and as we were sitting around a large pole, there was a round chair, round bench, and I was always wondering when people were looking at us, are we like horses? My father would always tell me that if you wanted a healthy horse, you have to look in the mouth and count the teeth. Are they going to open our mouth and count our teeth? It was very funny, but to us, they looked at us very sternly because were we good enough to go to work for them? Well, the next employer was a great improvement. My work started at 4:30, 5 a.m., and sometimes lasted until 12 midnight or later. At least I had a roof over my head and food, and I was alive. My secret I trusted to no one. I played the role of an Aryan. I went every second Sunday. I had one Sunday off. And that was the Sunday I would get up early and go right to church. And there I was so happy because I could sit in the pew, hold my head in my hands, and I could cry. I could release my emotions. Nobody would question me in church. Now, I also had a little prayer book, which I still have to this day, which my girlfriend's mother, Mrs. Czarnek-Białkowska, gave me, and I have it right here. I cherish it. This is what saved my life. And you have Jesus right on the front page. Also, I prayed from it. When I went to church, I would kneel down just like all the other people do, and I would pray from it. I had also a rosary that she gave me. You know, I was prepared to go to confession. I went to communion. And as I kneeled in church, I would say my own prayers that I knew. Now came the bombs which fell all around us. And even though we were better off than other cities like Berlin, the area of Vienna that I lived in was hit hard. Again, it was a miracle that I remained in one piece. The terrible worry about my family got the best of me, and I risked my life and I wrote to my friend in Lublin. She answered me with 2 letters. In the second letter, I found out that my father had been shot at the brewery. I found out that my father, somebody had told the Gestapo that he was fighting there, one of the workers, and my father did not want to go to the concentration camp, as you know, so he jumped on the fence. He was able to jump on a fence, and he knew as long as he jumps on a fence, they're going to shoot him. And that was the death he preferred. So they shot him, and they buried him right next to the fence. I remember when I went to Lublin in '92, I went with my husband and my children, and one of the workers told me that one of the workers who was burying my father said, "Why are you burying him right next to the fence?" He said, "Well, we're burying him like a dog. He belongs, right? A dog belongs to the fence." And that worker spoke up and said, "But he's not a dog, he's a human being." Well, the Gestapo man that heard that gave that worker 3 years of heavy labor, and he never made it. He died. Just for saying that he is not a dog, he's a human being. My dearest aunt, it was not easy to hide so much hurt and grief under a mask of unconcern. In some moments, I already wanted to uncover everything and give myself up to the same fate as my family. But then the wish of my father came to me, to fight through till the last, Hitler zum Trotz. And this has helped me overcome these feelings many times. And so, my dear aunt, it went until the Allied forces appeared in Vienna. Now, this is part of the story that I can tell you. My daughter and my son want to write a book, and it would be very interesting for people to read it, because it was nothing hidden. It was something very, very public. The Jews were being murdered all over. They were not kindly spoken to. They were just like, in fact, I think the dogs they treated better than they treated Jews. That's how gruesome a country who was so full of intelligence became full of Nazis. Now, after the Americans came in, nobody was a Nazi. I knew a lot of them that were Nazis in Vienna, but all of a sudden there wasn't one that was a Nazi. They were all changed, they all changed their clothes and you couldn't find a Nazi with a candle. So I knew very well who was a Nazi, and I promised to myself that one day I'm going to take one of that Nazi and I'm going to slaughter him and put salt on the wounds. You think I did this? I couldn't do it. I'm not a killer. I couldn't hurt anybody. The only thing that I can probably hurt was an ant, because I didn't like ants coming into the house. I am not a killer. And I want you to know that the reason I'm talking is because of hatred. I want you to know how terrible hatred can be. It is a terrible word. I wish we could just cross it out of the dictionary. I want you to know, if you join any groups, don't let it be for hatred, because that's what happened to Germany. Hatred made killers out of many people. Please remember that. Remember my talking to you and what I had to go through to survive as a Jew. I want you to know that many people don't think twice about doing something hateful against another. Try not to do it. Try to keep yourself a nice person, somebody who thinks of the next human being as a human being like yourself. That's what I want you to remember. And please tell your friends, tell your parents, tell anyone you know what I have said. I have lived through this, and believe me, it was not easy. Don't hate anyone. If you don't feel good about somebody, just don't have anything to do with them. But no hatred. I want you to know that I brought with me the prayer book, so if anyone wants to see it, which I cherish. And I also brought a picture that my aunt gave me. I could not save any pictures at all. But I have a picture of my sister, my brother, and myself when we were still in Allenstein in East Prussia. I was only a little girl then. But I have the picture with me, and if anybody wants to see it, please come up and take a look at it. We were just plain human beings. My sister at that time was going to a college, and she knew Latin like a language. She wanted to go on to become a doctor, but that was never given to her. My brother was just a young guy going to high school, and when we were in Allenstein, he was beaten up by some thugs. My father had to run away because he was told by a good friend of his that he's going to be arrested. Being arrested meant taken to a concentration camp. So he disappeared. My grandfather's brewery, he had a brewery and a brick factory and lots of land, was right across the border, just 2 kilometers from the German border. So he was able to make it to his father. And he was there and looking for a job, for a brewer's job. We could not take it much longer being alone there. And my mother said, we're going to have to move. Of course, we couldn't take many things with us, but we did get across the border and lived in an attic apartment at my grandfather's house until my father found a job. And the job was in Lublin. And a Jew was owning the brewery that he worked in. When he first came to the brewery, the brewer that was working before him had been so bad that he had to pour all the beer out, make new barrels, start from fresh. And you know, when you start beer, you have to have yeast. So he wrote to his father to please send him yeast. And his father did send him yeast. And the yeast, when I was there in '92, the brewer showed me the yeast was still there. They kept the yeast going from that time on, from the 1940s, when my father received the yeast. Of course, I was very, very taken when I saw the yeast that my father brought to the brewery. And my father's beer was excellent. In fact, he had studied, when he was in Germany, he studied how the Germans made beer. He went to Königsberg, which is a big city not far from Allenstein, where we were. And he had learned how the Germans were making that excellent beer. And when the Germans came in, the soldiers loved the beer. And I think it was part of the reason that we were alive is because the soldiers just loved that beer. So that was one of the reasons that I was alive too. My father was a wonderful brewer, and all the soldiers that came to get the beer were absolutely thrilled to have such good beer. Well, a time came where apparently the boss, who was a German, got the orders that we also have to go to Majdanek concentration camp. And what I didn't tell you is that we could see Majdanek concentration camp from an upper floor in the brewery. In the beginning, when they were first building and some chimneys, we were wondering, what are they building in the middle of the war, a factory? We couldn't understand what it was, but that was Majdanek. And I was for 2 weeks, for 2 months, I was in Majdanek too. And I can't really tell you the story because there's not enough time. But by many, I came out of it. It's wonderful. Somebody, something above me, and I think it was God, that made me to be alive because I knew exactly what was happening in Majdanek. And if you have any questions later on, please raise your hand. I'll be only too happy to answer any questions that you have. I also have, my father gave me some zloty. Remember I told you 1,000 zloty? I have 300 of this money that I saved. You probably can now put it on the wall, make wallpaper out of it. But to me, it is extremely important that I save that money. So if you want to come and see it by any chance, if you want to ask me any questions, I told you as much as I could right now, because time doesn't permit to go any further. But I do have time, I believe, for questions.
A round of applause for
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy that you came to hear me. I hope something remains of it. That you learn that hatred is a horrible, horrible thing. And that's what killed the Germans. And the beasts. I must call them beasts. Because they were not human beings. And that's what Hitler made out of them. Hitler and his companions. And if anyone has a question, please, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. I have a microphone here if anyone wants to pose one. Okay.
Thank you so much, Helen, for coming. It's really amazing to hear your story. I'm just curious to your thoughts of the Polish government now making it a crime to implicate any Poles in the Holocaust.
That is very wrong. Because there were too many Poles that were too happy about what the Germans did. I know it because I lived there. In fact, the lady that was going to save me first, she was afraid of her neighbors. There were not too many people that were sorry about what the Germans did. They felt that the Germans really came to do a good deed. Those were the ones that were terrible anti-Semitic. I went to school in Poland, and I was the only Jewish girl in class. And I wondered why some kids get up and talk to, I heard that they said how terrible the Jews are. But Helen is a Jew and she's nice. And that always bothered me. Why am I the only Jew that's nice? Catholicism was taught in the classes. Instead of I'm supposed to go out because I'm Jewish, I decided that I'm going to stay. I want to hear why I'm so different from any other Jew. And I heard in Catholicism, that's what got me to see what was happening. The teacher was telling them that the Jews killed Christ. Now, I knew Jesus was something very, very dear and special to the children. And of course, they hated the Jews because they killed Christ. They killed their God. He was the Son of God. I didn't quite understand because I believed only in one God. But many would say that he was the Son of God. And of course, if somebody did something terrible to the Son of God, of course they're going to hate. And those were the Jews. Well, that was the wrong way to teach. First of all, Jesus was a Jew. And he went to death as a Jew. That's what I learned. And the people there was one guy among the people that was a bad one. And he was the one that told the Romans that Jesus is going to make something out of the people. He was too strong for the Romans. He was too wise. And that's who gave away Jesus. The Romans did not want a leader among the people. And they killed him just like they killed many other Jews on crosses. Jesus was not the only one that was killed on the cross. There were many others. I don't know if you know that, but there were many Jews killed in that time. Now, I feel terrible for the people that had this inkling, this idea that all the Jews were terrible. I'm sure there were some that were terrible, just like among other people. There were some that were good and some that were not good. But not all people were terrible. And they certainly did not deserve the horrible treatment they got from the Germans. So I want you to remember that. Hatred leads to terrible things. Our sacred Torah tells us that you are supposed to love your neighbor as you love yourself. You don't have to love your neighbor, but you can be kind. And that's the way I conducted my life from the time I was able to realize that I'm also a person who can hate. But I decided not to hate. I decided to not even hate the Germans, because all Germans that are born now are not responsible for what happened. These are young people who are deserving to live their life free and not to succumb to the word hatred. Of course, some of them will be taught by their parents the wrong things. I've never seen a baby that hates. But if the parents instill hatred in that baby, it's going to hate. So I want you to know that I will never, never do anything to another human being that will present meanness and hatred. And I hope that I taught all of you the same thing. Be kind to one another. The world would be a different place if you were all kind and countries were kind to one another. So remember that. Remember that, tuck that deep into your heart and tell it to your parents, tell it to your sisters and brothers, your friends. No hatred. Okay? Any other
Helen.
questions?
Yep, I've got one. And I own the microphone, so I'll invoke that privilege. If you're comfortable doing so, could you recount that remarkable escape from Madonic that you had?
Oh yeah, well, it's again a story, but I will tell you as close as I can. Because I could not get an education, my father sent me to the ghetto. I had a wonderful way of getting into the ghetto. That was in the beginning of the war, because I had a card that said I was working. And I was working in the brewery. I was washing bottles. I was helping my sister who was taking care of the flowers. I was working. But that was the stamp of approval to go into the ghetto. And I had a teacher there. No Polish teacher wanted to try to teach me because it meant death. Everything was the threat of death. So of course a Jewish lady in the ghetto had enough threats, and she had no way of living because she had no money. She was a teacher in a Hebrew high school, and she was very gifted. And so my father found her and was paying her money to teach me as much as she could possibly do. I was only in grammar school when the war started. Well, she taught me for several years until they started to take out men. They told us that all of a sudden they surround the street and the men are going to a worker camp. But we never heard from them again. All of a sudden they surrounded the street that I was in, and they took out women. And even though I was only a little girl, they considered me a woman. And they took me to concentration camp Majdanek. Now, how did my father find out that I was in Majdanek? He knew I wasn't there, I didn't come home. A very good friend of my father's, who was a mailman during the pre-war years, he knew how to speak German, and he said he comes from the city called Posen, which was also a border of Germany, and that many people in Posen knew how to speak German, and he spoke German to my father. My father became very friendly with him and gave him a lot of beer to take home, and served him beer every time he came to the brewery, and he considered him a friend. He said he wasn't German, but when the war started, we didn't see him. Of course, there was no letters coming either. But he was working in Majdanek. He was a German, and he was the one that noticed me. And he came to my father, he said, if you can give me a little money, I don't want much, but just something so I can get your daughter out of there. I'm going to try very hard. And what he tried to do is wait for an opportune moment when the children of the Volksdeutsche and the Germans, they were called the Hitlerjugend, came to the concentration camp of their own free will to see how one works with Jews, or people who don't deserve to live. One girl once told me that we are like weeds and we have to be taken out by the roots. That I was told when I was 11 years old, and I never forgot it. Well, this German took me out of the line of the workers and pushed me into a dark room and threw some clothes at me. They were Hitlerjugend clothes. The Hitlerjugend was in Majdanek. And the minute he threw them at me and said, mach schnell, make fast, I knew what he wanted me to do. I dressed into the Hitlerjugend clothes. The Hitlerjugend was just about my age. And he knew that I spoke German, which was a great help to me. Somebody would talk to me, I could answer them. He pushed me right into a lot of kids. There were many of them. And I was very much afraid they would recognize that I'm not one of them. So when we walked out of the gates of Majdanek, I looked for a big house that we walked by, which had a large door going to the backyard. That's how the big houses were. They had large doors that you had to go through in order to go to the back of the house, to the yard. I disappeared behind one of those doors, and they never questioned. I waited until it got dark, and then I crawled, almost on my fours, right through the fields, where there were a lot of fields before the brewery, and then there was like a small, an extra high place where the brewery stood. And I knew where I was. It took me a whole night to go that normally would take just 10 minutes. I got up on that mount. There was a fence made out of wood, thank God, and I knew where all the holes in the fence were. So I got through the fence, and there were dogs. They were wolf dogs. They were guarding the brewery, and a watchman. I was not afraid of the dogs because I raised most of them. So I was just afraid that the watchman wouldn't see me, and I appeared at the door of my father. I remember saying, "This is your daughter, Helen." I kept on saying it over and over again. And then I gave him my Jewish name, which was Perle. He opened the door, and you can imagine the joy when he saw me. He thought I was never going to come home. Well, he was very much afraid that the Germans are going to notice that I'm not there, and they're going to come looking for me. So he rigged up, there was a cellar right under the brewery office. We had that cellar, and we had put potatoes there and vegetables in the sand. It's not a basement like we have now. We had a lot of sand there. And my father rigged up a place for me out of wood and saw to it that I would be able, if I heard some heavy footsteps. Now, the Germans did not tiptoe. They had heavy boots. If they came to the office, I would hear it. And then I should go under the stack of woods, pull one piece of wood away so that the potatoes would fall right over me, so they wouldn't be able to see me. Luckily, nobody ever came to look for me. So they were able to feed me and make me look more like a human being, because I was very pale and very skinny. I had very little to eat in the concentration camp. And then I appeared, and my father got me a worker's permit. So that's how I was able to get out of Majdanek. And my parents knew exactly what Majdanek meant. It meant the death of you. There was no coming out of Majdanek. And I was just so fortunate to have had that man who was really a German, but actually had some kind of feeling left in one little part of his heart. He didn't want me to die. So I got out of there. I don't know if that man is still alive. I'm sure not, because he was grown up and it's been many years since. But that man, who was a German, rescued me out of Majdanek concentration camp. Okay?
Any other questions? Are you okay for a couple more questions?
Pardon?
Are you okay for a couple more questions?
Yes, definitely. Anybody would like to come up here and take a look at this Lucky, which
Helen?
is the one that I have.
Helen?
Take a look at a picture, by all means, come over here, or at the little Polish prayer book that I
Helen?
have. If you know Polish, you'll be able to pray from it.
Helen,
I
how
know
old were you
Polish
at the
very well.
concentration camp, and how long were you there for?
Pardon?
How old were you at the concentration camp, and how long were you there for?
I was only 12 when I was in the concentration.
And how long were you there for?
In the concentration camp? Just 2 months, when he rescued me, yeah. When I escaped, I was 14. It was a year before, actually. I was almost 13 when I was in the concentration camp. And when I escaped, when nobody was around me, I was all alone. As I said, in a very hostile world. I was Krystyna Helena Czerniakowska. Don't forget that. Not Helena Przysłuska. Krystyna Helena Czerniakowska. And I knew how to go about in church to give my sins to the priest, and then to get communion, which seemed to me almost like a little piece of matzah that was put on my tongue. And I hardly had any sins, really. But I prayed out of my little book. Praying to God never hurts. So, if you want to come up and take a look at it, by all means, come right here and take a look. You can see my brother, my sister, and myself as a little girl.
Helena,
Yes.
ja jestem Stasia Raczyńska.
Pardon?
Yes, my mother was born in Kielce and my father was born in Lublin.
Oh, lovely.
Lublin, and I have the similar stories. I was raised listening to all these stories. My parents were taken by the Germans, and were in Germany for 6 years working for the Germans.
So they were Polish, not you.
They were Polish. They were Polish. But they knew many people that disappeared. They had many friends that disappeared in the camps. And they were lucky enough to end up like you did, working for the Germans. I want you to tell your story. I want you to write your story with your children, because what you said is so important, that nobody hates. And my father taught me the same thing. At the end of the war, there was an American soldier that gave him a gun and told him to kill this German because he knew that the Germans had made him work for so many years. And my father refused, and he thought that he was going to be killed. But the important thing that he always taught me is not to hate. And your story is so important to the young people, to tell them not to hate, because it's a terrible thing.
Very important not to hate. That's the main thing, and that's why I'm rehashing everything. It's not easy to go back to my history and rehash. You know, believe me, many nights I can't sleep because I'm rehashing it all the time. I'm talking to many children, many young people. As many as ask me, I am talking, because my father said to me at the end, when we said goodbye, he says, and please, if you should stay alive, tell everybody what happened here. And that's what I'm doing. I'm telling the story like my father wanted me to tell. Everything that happened there. And I think you'll be the better off for that. No hatred. Okay? Thank you very much. I'm so glad that you were able to come here and listen to me and to the story that this lady just told. And she is actually somebody from Poland, and her parents were in Poland. And they were working like I was working. Of course, they didn't take her to concentration camp because they were not Jews.
But they came to the States the same as you, by the Red Cross. In 1949, they were sponsored by the Red Cross.
Now, her parents were sponsored by the Red Cross, but they were probably in Germany.
Correct.
Yeah, and they had to work very hard, very hard.
They didn't go back to Poland because they were so poor, and they wanted a better life.
They didn't go back to Poland because they were so poor, and they wanted a better life.
My sister was born in Germany.
And this lady's sister was born in Germany. So,
I love you.
Thanks everybody for coming. If you want to talk to Helen, feel free to come up.